What is text criticism? Why is it important? Who does this stuff? And how does it fit into the modern church today? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in this video. Let's get into it. When we go through the scholarly world, we find a whole bunch of references to the word criticism. And at first glance, if you don't know any different, the word criticism sounds like you're criticizing or critiquing the Bible. That's not what this word means, at least not in the scholarly world. So what does it mean? Well, there are a number of different types of criticism that we find in the scholarly world around the Bible. We find form criticism, redactive criticism, text criticism, just to name a few. And some of these have got negative connotations with them in terms of they're driven philosophically. Others are actually really helpful to us. And discerning the difference between those is not always super easy or super clear. Historical criticism, for instance, there's something to be said for historical criticism, but we also need to be really careful with it because otherwise we go back and we question the earliest church authorities to say where these books of the Bible came from. So we need to be careful when we use this word criticism and recognize that not everything when it comes to the Bible that has the word critical or criticism attached to it is negative. So that's what I'm really hoping to help invest into you in this video. Now, over the last month or so, I've published a number of videos talking about how do we get closer to the Greek New Testament, or why there's so many different manuscripts and different copies. And really, the fact that we have all of these raises the question of, well, how do we determine how all these things fit together? How do we determine which reading is the best, which manuscript is more reliable than the other ones, and so on and so forth. And if you haven't watched those videos, then click just up here and you'll see there's a couple of cards there that will give you access to those. You can go watch those and come back to this video, watch them after this video, whatever you feel so inclined to do. But one of the things that we saw, particularly in that one about all the different manuscripts, was now that you've got all these different manuscripts, and we've talked about how they all came about, why there are so many copies. We talked about intentional errors and unintentional errors, and why copyists throughout the ages have made these kinds of changes. We talked about that, so go check that video out. But the question then arises, now that we arrive at the 21st century, or even the 15th century for that matter, we have the question of, well, which ones of these do we print? And that's really where the job of a text critic comes in, to do the work of text criticism. So what is it that a text critic will do? What is text criticism? Well, text criticism essentially is a very broad subject that comprises basically of three fundamental jobs. First, a text critic will focus on the making and transmission of ancient texts. That is to say, they'll talk about the difference between the different materials, how they were created, how the copyists went about their job, and how they were disseminated and spread throughout the church. That's the first part of a role of a text critic, or part of text criticism, is to work out where did all these texts come from and how are they transmitted. The second element of this is to work out the description of all these different witnesses to the original writings. So we go through and we look at, well, here's a text, where was it come from, how did it get created, who created it, what kind of style did they use, how do we think this was copied, was it copied from somebody read it out loud, or did he have several other documents in front of him and he copied from those different documents? So this provenance, if you like, that how we got those texts, this is also part of the role of text criticism, to work out how we got these documents that we got, where they came from, and how reliable they are given the things that we do know about them. And then thirdly, the third role of text criticism is really to understand how all of this rolls together into the history of the transmission of the text from an edition point of view, how we think through which editions that we're going to use, or which manuscripts we're going to use, and how that flows into the text traditions and the books that gets printed, like the Greek New Testaments that get printed, and how those Greek New Testaments interact and flow together and influence one another, and so on. So that's really the third thing. So it's really focused on the creation and transmission of text, is focused on the description and history of the different documents, and thirdly on how those all come together and then influence the tradition of the text as a whole. So somebody who does these three things, or one of these three things, is what we refer to as a text critic. That means to say they are a scholar who really devotes themselves, normally because they have a love for Christ and a passion for His Word. They are normally somebody who will devote themselves to the in-depth study of these manuscripts, and often as a career choice for life. They're people who are going to study and learn the original languages. They're somebody who are going to be have a good understanding of the transmission of the text and how the text has been maintained over the centuries. They've generally developed a pretty broad understanding of church history to understand what strains of the church, what elements of the church have been actually working to preserve these, and how does that actually influence that text, and likewise, how do those texts then influence the church itself as well. This is kind of an interesting thing, and I'm really always interested in history type subjects, but that's for another day. And then there are people typically who will examine these documents, perhaps go to the museums or libraries or repositories where these are stored and look at them in a lot of detail, or perhaps now with modern technology and the fact that so many of these are now being photographed, they can actually look at high quality representations of these and actually work from those photographs rather than from the original text, which means that today we have, again, an embarrassment of riches compared to what, say, text critics had 100 years ago, which also means that today you and I can actually look at some of these texts ourselves online. I'm going to leave a link or two below so where you can take a look at some of the pictures and photos of these texts that have now been made available for free on the internet as well. So go take a look at those down below as well. So when did text criticism actually start? Well, the answer to that is it pretty much started with the invention of the printing press. And you say, well, why so? The answer is that prior to the printing press, a copyist would have one or maybe three or however many documents it was in front of them, and they would work from one of those primary documents and copy it to another place, making perhaps marginal notes or modifications as they went through and saw variations between the couple of copies that they had. But when the printing press came along, the discussion was, okay, we can print hundreds and hundreds of copies of the Greek New Testament very quickly, but which of these texts do we print and publicize to that extent? And that then led to the question of, well, maybe we need to go back and look at these. And it all started around about 60 years after the creation of the printing press. The first printed Greek New Testament was the Complutensian project, which was actually 4 different languages put into 4 different volumes that were Greek, Aramaic, Hebrew, and Latin. Those 4 languages were printed kind of side by side at the same time, and that was essentially the first printed text of the Greek New Testament that was published in a format that was available more broadly. However, that wasn't the first published Greek New Testament. That was the first printed Greek New Testament. Between the time when that was printed in 1514 and published in 1517, Erasmus went out, collated his own Greek text, and put that side by side between Greek and Latin, and he had that printed in 1515 and published in 1516. And so Erasmus's Greek New Testament became not the first printed, but the first published Greek New Testament available. And even though it was not as good a copy as the Complutensian project, it did, because it was smaller, it was a single volume, it was easier to manage, easier to produce as well for that matter, easier to publicize and get more and more people using it. That became the default and most broadly published Greek text available for really a couple of hundred years. It went through a couple of modifications, but eventually as it went through those modifications, it became known as the Textus Receptus, or the received text, which one of those edits later on became the foundation for the King James Bible. So Erasmus's text essentially became the first published critical edition of the Greek New Testament. What is a critical Greek New Testament? Well, essentially a critical Greek New Testament is a Greek New Testament that is based on text critical principles, okay? And so you can understand the first published one is the first one based on this issue, this problem that we have of, well, which one do we publish? And so Erasmus, when he created his Greek text, he went through and he had to make some decisions about what he was going to publish and where. And for instance, when he published his Greek New Testament, he didn't have the last page of the book of Revelation. So he ended up getting a Latin edition, translated that back into Greek, and that was what he published. And of course, so that then led to some very interesting differences between that last, the last few verses of Revelation 22 and what we find in pretty much any Greek text anywhere. After Erasmus's time, we get into a bunch of other people who are then working on Greek texts, and we come up with some rules that then become quite commonplace for working out which variations are going to be established. Early on, when text critical scholars were starting to think about, well, which text do we print, they would say, well, this has got the most support for it. There are more manuscripts that focus on this particular reading, so let's print that one. But then when we come to the 17th century, the early 17th century, we have Bengal, who basically says, no, we need to weigh the text and we need to evaluate those. And so we need to make choices. And then he went on and said, well, probably the harder construction is more likely to be correct because scholars are more likely to smooth things out than they are to make things more difficult to understand. So the harder reading becomes the more likely to be correct one. Then after that, we have Johann Griesbach, who himself actually in the 18th and early 19th century started to consider that because scholars are more likely to add material than subtract material, the shorter reading is more likely to be the accurate one rather than the longer reading, and so on and so forth until we get to the people like Tischendorf and then later on others in the 19th century as well. So essentially the process of text criticism has been refined over the centuries so that today we have a pretty well established sort of set of disciplines around text criticism, and we also have some rules that we generally hold to between us as scholars that we generally agree on. Now, that doesn't mean to say there's no argument. There's plenty of argument, and anybody who holds to the superiority of the textus receptus is likely to argue that in the comments below. Look forward to hearing from you there. But this is a field that now has quite a bit of discipline around it, and we can actually think through some of these things with a lot of consistency and logic. So that's a real high-level overview of text criticism, and I'd love to hear from you. Have you heard of this stuff before? Have you been into this stuff? Let me know in the comment section below your thoughts, and I look forward to hearing from you there. I may disagree, you may disagree with me, and that's all good. We can still be brothers and sisters in Christ and get along. So with that, thanks so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Until then, keep taking small, consistent steps toward mastery. I look forward to seeing you, like I said, in the next video. We'll see you there.